Always be yourself. Unless you can be Batman. And then always be Batman. That tongue-in-cheek quote always makes me laugh, but turns out to have some fascinating truth to it, as children impersonating Batman in their work demonstrated notably increased perseverance. Today's guest, distinguished McKnight University Professor Dr. Stephanie Carlson, was one of the researchers who helped bring that discovery to the forefront. We'll dig into what that and other intriguing elements of her research means for us in our daily professional, personal, and athletic lives in today's discussion. She's also doing some pioneering work on how we can tap many recent cognitive findings to improve our productivity and our overall performance. So get ready to take some notes as we dive into the latest findings here on the Catalyst 360 podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360. And before we jump into the conversation with Dr. Carlson, one very important note. We were thrilled to receive the news that Fortune magazine rated Catalyst Coaching Institute as the #1 health and wellness coach training program in their annual ranking. Immense honor, and we're grateful for all of those in the Catalyst alumni community who have trusted us with their coaching education since our genesis way back in 2007. If you're not yet a coach but are considering going that route, our programs are now filling up earlier than ever, as you can imagine. So please don't wait too long if it's a priority. Registration and all the details are available on our Institute site at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or reach out anytime. We can talk through your questions. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And now it's time to step into the Batcave with Dr. Stephanie Carlson on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Welcome to the show, the Batman effect and all the elements that go around there. Dr. Carlson, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's dig into that one, the subject that got you on our radar, the Batman effect, and its effect, especially with your research on perseverance in children. What's the story there? What do we know? What are we wondering about? What are we continuing to dig into?
Well, I'm a developmental psychologist, and I am primarily interested in the development of children's self-control, impulse control, and what we call executive function skills. And young children are notoriously poor at self-control. So they're,
as are adults.
Any parent, teacher, will tell you that it certainly seems to take a long time to develop these self-control or executive function skills. So with that being my primary interest in my research lab at the University of Minnesota, we look for ways to help kids improve self-control. So we look for strategies that even a young child can use, and particularly strategies that leverage things that they already are prone to do, like play. So kids in the preschool period spend as much as 2/3 of their waking hours in pretend play. And we, like I said, wanted to kind of leverage that, look at what kids are already doing, and see if there is a way to help them use that to control themselves. So in adult psychology, there's a phenomenon that we learned about, and some of my colleagues who collaborated with me on this work, including Angela Duckworth and Ethan Cross, we knew about this phenomenon called psychological distance. And the idea is that there are various ways that you can distance your mind or your perspective from a situation. And cognitive behavioral therapists have known for a long time that this is a very useful strategy for helping you regulate your emotions, regulate your thoughts, feelings, and obsessive thoughts, or sort of persistent thoughts. And so there are various ways of obtaining psychological distance on a situation. So one is like physical distance. You can literally step back, or if you think about kind of taking a panoramic view of a situation, and you can, walk away literally from a situation and get some space from it, some physical space, and that can help. Just as, kind of the 24-hour rule of not responding to an email that might have triggered you or, made you upset.
Right.
So that's getting a form of distance from the situation, right? And then there are other types of distance, and one is called social distancing. And that's where you imagine the situation as if you were someone else. And it's kind of like, what would my best friend do? The one who always seems to have it together, or what would my boss do? Or what would someone I admire, someone who seems to have these superpowers, what would Batman do? And so we took this combination of kids being inclined to engage in pretend play, together with the research on social psychological distance that shows that, at least in adults, this is a useful strategy to think about a situation as if you were someone else. And so we put kids into situations where they would have to exert some self-control, these executive function skills. And for some of the kids, they were randomly assigned to pretend that they were somebody else while doing this activity. So one of these activities that we tried was persisting at a boring but important task. And we were taking kind of like homework as our example there. Like sometimes homework is boring, but nevertheless, kids are told it's important to do it.
Sure.
And to persevere at it. So they have many other things they would rather be doing, many distractions in the environment. Screens, of course, are a big distraction. And nevertheless, children have to sometimes do things and put the screen away or set it aside for a period of time. So we created this situation in the lab with 4 to 6-year-old kids where they were introduced to a task in front of them. It was on a laptop, and it was a kind of boring game where they had to, hit the space bar whenever they saw some cheese, but whenever they saw a cat, they're supposed to withhold pressing the space bar. It's called a go, no go task, but we made it boring by making the time between trials rather slow. And there are lots of trials. And then we said, it's really important that you do this activity, but it can get boring. So if you want to, when you want to, you could take a break and play on this iPad. And the iPad was right next door, placed right next to the laptop. And it had games preloaded on it, like Angry Birds and things like that kids really like to play. And we taught them how to take a break by pressing the break key on the laptop, and then they could play on the iPad.
And that was just, they could pick to do that at any point. They could say, I'm sick of this, I'm going to do this. Right.
And so it's important that it be of their own volition.
Right.
It's important to let them know that they get to choose. Right? We're not telling you what to do. This is not external control. Right. What we're trying to foster here is intrinsic control. And so, and then it was a 10-minute work period. And we measured the amount of time that they spent on the work task, the sort of homework-like task, as opposed to the distractor task. And I can tell you that 4 to 6-year-olds, if left to their own devices, will spend 3/4 of that amount of time on the iPad.
Wow.
They'll spend 75% of the time on the iPad.
Yes, doing the games.
But for the group of children that was instructed, while you're working on this, you could pretend to be somebody else. And we gave them a choice of which character they could choose to be. So we had like Batman, Bob the Builder, Dora the Explorer, Elle, the princess. And so kids could choose their character, and then they would wear a prop that kind of was there to remind them who their character was. So if they chose Batman, they'd put on a black cape. And if they chose Elle, they put on a tiara. And kids who were in that condition were significantly more likely to persist at the work task. for a significantly longer period of time as compared to kids in the kind of regular control condition where they weren't instructed to do that.
And you said significantly, I don't expect you to remember the number, but any chance? You said it's 75% games on their own.
Oh,
What
right.
was the general number without, when they did take on that cape or that tiara or that crown or whatever?
I believe they spent over half of the time on the work task.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and we, in the sort of control condition, we were instead reminding kids, making them sort of socially, psychologically closer to themselves by emphasizing I, the word I. So like, I want you to think about how you're feeling while you do this, and ask yourself, how is Brad feeling while I'm doing this?
But
that, that brought them even closer to their own perspective, which probably made them persist even less long on the work task. Whereas when you take the social distance further and further, the longer they persisted at the task. So if you use the term, there's another group that was instructed to use the term you. So ask yourself, how are you feeling? And that's a little bit more separate from I.
Yeah, totally.
So you can use language, just a simple, for adults, just a simple language trick. My colleague Ethan Cross has shown can do that trick. But for kids, it's even more helpful if they put on a cape.
Well, and there's even the research, and it's very subtle. They just started looking at this, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but with athletes where you give yourself the response of, you've got this, meaning me talking to myself, versus I've got this, or I can do this. It's you've got this, you can do this. It's almost like you put a cheerleader on your shoulder telling you that versus the direct self-talk, that it's more effective. And it kind of sounds like that's related to what you're finding. That's
right. And this is, I think, a really good technique for athletes or anyone who's trying to, compete or work and perform at a high level.
Wow, this is fun. All right, so I'm going to admit something embarrassing here, but when I was in physical therapy school, I was in neuroscience class, I was struggling, and so I was like, all right, I'll dress up like a neuroscientist. I don't know what a neuroscientist dresses up like, but when I was 22 years old, I thought they wore a bow tie and suspenders. So I'd go into the library, and I felt like I was studying more effective, probably making it up, probably just one of those things that my classmates laughed at me about. But anything to that?
Yes, actually, I don't know if the latest research has been replicated yet. So, we always feel more confident about effects when they are replicated. But a colleague of mine, Adam Ghazali, has looked at this phenomenon in adults where they perform significantly better on a cognitive task if they were dressed as a scientist compared to if they were dressed as an artist.
Interesting.
And so the only difference was wearing a lab coat versus an artist's smock.
And I even saw something last week, week before, about work settings with all the Zoom stuff that you and I are actually doing right now. The difference between a full work outfit, so something professional, versus PJs or sweats versus half and half. They did find a difference between those three choices. And that seems to kind of fit into what you're talking about as well.
I think it can. So part of self-presentation is not only for others, but it can also be for yourself.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So does it extend beyond perseverance? I remember growing up, we'd be out playing basketball or football, and for my age, it was, I'm David Thompson or I'm Larry Zonka. And literally, as I was prepping for this interview, I was talking to my wife and I was saying, I remember, like, when I was Larry Zonka, I was more likely to try to bust through the line than when I was Brad. Or when I was David Thompson, I was more likely to take that outside shot and boom. Does it extend beyond perseverance, or do we not know that yet?
Well, I think, yeah, so that's a great example. And part of the inspiration for this whole line of research was an interview that LeBron James did, where he was referring to himself in the third person. and he kept saying, and I ask, and I say, LeBron, he was trying to decide if he should move to Cleveland, at the time. And so I said, he was saying to himself, LeBron, you got to think about your values, think about your family, things like that. And so it was a difficult life decision that he was trying to make. Sure. And he was using this crutch of kind of getting this distance from it mentally, psychologically, through, language distancing. So I think, and then there are other, that wasn't the inspiration for this research, but we took it a few steps further and in different directions. So we also looked at whether this technique could help kids regulate their emotions. So not just persist at a task, but when they are dysregulated, could they use a technique like this to bring their emotions under control? And so in this case, we had kids working on we showed them a toy. They got to choose a toy. And it was a pretty major toy, like a remote control car or a really big doll. And they would choose the toy, and we'd say, and then we'd say, well, okay, we're going to play with this later, but let's keep it safe. And we would put it then in a large, clear box. And then we'd say, let's keep it really safe. And then we would lock the box with a key. It's a giant set of keys, a giant, a ring with dozens of keys on it. And then the experimenter would say, I'm not sure which key it is, and try a couple. And then she said, oh, it's this one. So she would successfully lock the box. Then she set the keys on the table in the corner of the room. And then they went about their business doing some other games and tasks. And then she said, okay, now it's time for you to play with the toy in the box. I have to leave the room to do some work, but here's the key ring. And you can try to open the box. And but there are a lot of keys here, so it can get kind of frustrating.
And these are still 4 to 6 year olds?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 4 to 6 year olds. So it can get kind of frustrating. So if you want to, when you want to, you can stop trying and ring this bell, call me, and I'll come back. But if you do that, just remember, then you're not going to get to play with the toy. So then again, it was a 10-minute period. And we have these great videos of kids working on this, trying all these keys. But the experimenter surreptitiously swapped the key ring with a different one that looked identical. But instead, in this key ring, none of the keys worked. So it was a futile effort. And we measured how long kids, persisted at this. And then again, kids were randomly assigned to different groups. And one group was instructed to pretend to be somebody else. That, it can help if you pretend to be somebody else when you're feeling frustrated. And they got to choose their character. And we have a great video, for example, of a child who chose to be Rapunzel, and she's wearing a tiara, and she's struggling with the keys. And at one point she drops them, and she says, "Oh my goodness." And her tiara starts to fall down, and she pushes the tiara back up on her forehead. And then she says to herself, "How is Rapunzel feeling?" And then she went back to work on the keys. And so, and then we have another child who pretended to be Batman. And afterward we asked all the kids, we said, "Were you feeling frustrated while you were working on that?" And he said, he's now playing with the remote control car that he's just received. And he said, "No, Batman never gets frustrated."
Wow. Wow.
So we have some
Wow.
good, kind of manipulation check, we call that, that, kids were thinking about what we had been asking them to think about, and that it seemed to be helping.
Wow.
But certainly, the same kind of techniques can be useful for adults, for athletes. And then I'll tell you about one more, more recently. It's not only social distance, but there's another kind of psychological distance called temporal distancing. And temporal kind of refers to time. And so this is a technique where you imagine your future self. You imagine the situation happening in the future and how you're going to handle it. So this is common for a lot of visualization techniques for athletes and others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so if you're just sort of imagining an interview, for example, you might, think about your future self, think about what the questions might be, practice responding to them or things like that. And, very common technique. But we didn't know if little kids could do this. They're just starting around age 4 to understand time and understand the future from a kind of metacognitive sense. And they start to use the word tomorrow earlier than that, but they do, we don't really have evidence until 4 so that they really understand the future. And even older than that they understand, that when they're an adult, you can say, when you're an adult, like your mom or your dad, do you think you'll prefer coffee in the morning or a juice box? And most 4-year-olds will still say, I want a juice box.
Obviously, of course. Why would I want coffee? But by age 5 or so, they're starting to say, well, when I'm an adult, I'll probably want coffee. So we, again, put kids in situations where they have to exert self-control and these executive function skills. And in this case, one group of children is instructed to, before they do that task, to imagine themselves succeeding at it. And we use pretend play to help them do that, to help them imagine that before they do the. So it's the visualization piece more than the future self piece in this case. I guess they overlap.
They overlap it. Yeah, I think. So we in this case, and we just have this accepted at a journal. It's coming out soon about my future self with 4-year-olds, where we look at their ability to save for the future. So in decision-making research, this is quite common. And of course, it's really important research in terms of retirement savings. For adults, most adults don't save enough. And so we were looking at kids' understanding of being able to save limited resources for the future. And the way we did this is we took a task that has been used in developmental psychology for a number of years, called a marble saving task. And so kids are shown a really cool marble run where, you put a marble down the top and it goes down these chutes and then it kind of lands, at the bottom. It goes around slides and tunnels and things like that. And kids love these marble runs. And so we show them a small marble run game, and we tell them that first we're going to play with this one. And then we take them into the room next door, and there's a really big marble run game, a huge one. And we say, and then we're going to come play in this with this marble game. And then we pull out, experimenter pulls out of her pocket 3 marbles. And she says, uh-oh, I only have 3 marbles for all our games today. So if you want to, you could save some marbles for the big marble game. First, we're going to play with the small one. Then we're going to play with the big one. But we only have 3 marbles for all of our games today. And we rigged the marble run so that once you put a marble down a chute, it gets trapped in a box at the bottom and you can't retrieve it.
Get it back.
So they're not reusable. And And then this was with 4-year-olds, and then again, left to their own devices, 75% or more of the kids spend all 3 marbles on the first marble round game. And then they're escorted into the room with the big marble game, and they're empty-handed. And they just have to wait without being able to play the game. Now, at the very end, the experimenter acts surprised that she's discovered 3 more marbles in a drawer.
Save the day.
So that everyone leaves, feeling happy and getting to play with the big one.
But generally, the kids are not saving it for the new one when they're in that 4 to 6 age. Interesting.
They're not saving. And this was with just 4-year-olds, this experiment so far. But there's, again, we assigned one group of kids to imagine that you do save a marble for the big marble game and how you'll feel. And we do this, they imagine it with a storyboard. So it's kind of a large board covered in felt. Mm-hmm. And then they can stick these little felt cutouts onto the felt
of what they're saving.
Storyboard is very low tech. Yeah. And so we help them, we kind of walk through let's imagine that you do save a marble. And so then they have a little felt marble, three little felt marbles, and they can put them next to the big marble game or the little marble game and then imagine what they're going to do. And then they imagine how they're going to feel. And then another group of kids was asked to imagine that they don't save any. Imagine that you don't save any for the big marble game. And we work it out on the storyboard. And then how will you feel?
Right.
And so kids of this age, they, by and large, they say that they'll feel happy if they do save a marble. And that they will feel really sad if they don't save a marble. And then we have control groups that have both positive and negative emotion, where they pretend about their bedtime routine later that night. So they also use the storyboard and they also play, they imagine their future selves, but it's irrelevant to this game. And what we find is that kids who imagine that they do save a marble are far more likely to. Again, over half of them will save at least 1 marble for the big game, whereas kids in the other conditions very rarely will save even a single marble for the big game. And it was really interesting to me because we weren't sure what was going to happen with the positive versus negative imagination. Mm-hmm. And our intuition was that maybe it's motivating for kids or people of any age to imagine a bad outcome and how bad you would feel if that bad outcome occurred. And that could motivate you to perform better, or to save. But instead, we found that was not the case. It didn't help them at all to imagine a bad outcome, and yet, parents and teachers, bosses, might be quite likely to actually try to motivate people with negative, motivate people with negative imagination or negative visualization.
So this study obviously harkens back in some format, at least in my head, to the marshmallow test, the classic. And one of the pushbacks on that in more recent years has been, well, you didn't peel out the cultural elements. The person who feels stable, the person who feels secure, the person who sees potential for, if I save this, there's a better future where I can spend it, responds very differently than the person who always has the ground shaking underneath them, no stability at home, et cetera, et cetera. And so, of course, I've got a marshmallow. There may not be a tomorrow. I'm eating the marshmallow. And so that was one of the pushbacks on an incredibly intriguing study. Were you able to peel any of that out, or was it on a completely different plane of what we're trying to find there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think some of these affective or emotional decision-making tasks and delay of gratification is an example of that, the marshmallow test. They are more prone to context effects. than some other measures, some other tried and true measures of executive function that kind of don't have that affective decision-making element. So we certainly see that with the marshmallow test. So other researchers, colleagues of mine, have shown that if you manipulate how trustworthy the experimenter is, that kids who are, even higher socioeconomic status kids will eat it right away. If they've had,
I don't trust you anyway.
Yeah, if they've had evidence that this experimenter doesn't keep her word, from a previous
interaction
event, a previous interaction, then they don't wait. And we've done some research together with my colleague Ann Maston with homeless and highly mobile children, and it's not surprising that we do see less delay of gratification in that population for the very reasons that you noted, that it's sort of a bird in the hand, is, you're something that you're going to take it now. It doesn't make sense in all contexts to delay gratification or to wait.
Right.
And then even what kids will and won't delay for can be influenced by context or culture. So my colleague Yuko Munakata and her colleagues have shown that kids in Japan wait significantly longer for food treats than kids in the United States, preschool age kids. However, if it's for waiting to open a gift, a wrapped gift, the kids in the United States waited significantly longer than the kids in Japan.
And
so
what was
So her explanation was that, so children in Japan, and she saw this when she was there with her kids on sabbatical, her kids attended a local school, that children in school are seated and they have to wait until everybody else is served before they can dig in. And it's context, it's well practiced. From a very early age, they're inculcated to wait for food. However, kids in the United States have a lot of practice with waiting to open gifts, such as holidays, and birthdays, or if they're having a birthday party and there's a gift table. Those gifts are sitting on that table for sometimes hours before they're open. But this is not a common thing in Japan, I'm told. So
interesting. So contextual.
The context can really matter in terms of how easy or difficult, or how much it makes sense to control yourself in these ways in different contexts.
My PhD work focused on something called functional mental toughness, and what you were talking about with that future self. We looked at that with some folks of the context of, okay, I'm doing this, whatever, race, workout. And if you had a partner that you were going to be sharing your results with later, you were going to be shooting a text, hey, here's how it went. How did yours go? Remotely. That did make a difference. And it sounds very similar to what you're describing, that if I know there's going to be a use for this, saving it is very different than I just don't feel like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much. And and sharing your successes is another technique. And kind of one of these principles we're starting to develop an understanding of and collecting the principles for improving executive function that seem to be effective.
Yeah.
And sharing your success, making it social, is one of them. So you can set up challenges with a friend or with a coworker. You can kind of share your score. You can have a leaderboard.
It matters, and it doesn't matter for everyone, but certainly it matters for a lot of folks. Your lab has a very cool name, the Developmental Social Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. Well done on the naming with that one. Any recent discoveries of late from that, or things you're kind of getting the grants lined up to start studying that might be intriguing for the listeners today?
Sure. So the research on my future self that I just mentioned is something that we're excited about. And we just extended that work to look at pro-social sharing. So pro-social behavior, including sharing or altruism. And I mean, a lot of the work that we do on self-control is focused on maximizing your own future benefit, right? So waiting for that second marshmallow, or saving a marble for the big game. Those are things to benefit oneself.
Sure.
But we've become really interested also in the extent to which some of these techniques can be used to cultivate benevolence toward others, and using these skills and strategies to benefit other people and not just oneself. And this also doesn't come very easily to young children. So we took the same marble saving game paradigm, but in this case, it was just one marble run. And we said, we only have this limited number of marbles. And there are 2 other kids coming in to the lab later today. And we showed them pictures of those kids. And so if you want to, you can save some marbles for the other kids so that they can also enjoy the marble game. And these are 4-year-olds, again, left to their own devices. They don't share a single marble for these other 4 kids. But if they imagine their future self and how good they'll feel about sharing, again, using that storyboard, they pretend, they work it out on the board, they imagine, they visualize it, how good they'll feel, they're significantly more likely to share.
Interesting.
A marble and sacrifice for their own benefit.
Any connection? Have you tried it with your sister, your brother, your best friend at school is going to come in? So rather than it just being a picture, a 2D picture, it's literally, well, Sally's going to be coming in next. And, she's your best friend, so you get to decide. Have you looked at that? Because it seems like that would have a massive, the things you'll do for your kids are astronomically more than what you would do for maybe, unfortunately, a random child or a random adult. Have you looked at that at all with these kids, of when there's a personal connection, if it shifts the dial at all?
We haven't, but I think that's a really good point. It's hard. We use strangers and we match them on the gender of the child and so forth, because that way we know that every participant in our study is we're able to control exactly how much information they have about that other person. Whereas if it's a sibling or someone that they know,
who knows?
then,
maybe they fight each other.
They don't really like that person or something. So that's why we do that, at least as a first step in the research, where we can kind of control things better. But I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, interesting.
We're also starting to get into some work with older kids, and I have a couple of projects going with the economist Jim Heckman from the University of Chicago, along with some other colleagues. And we're starting to look at the predictors of important outcomes in the future. So in one project that's funded by the National Science Foundation, we're hoping to predict kids' interests and achievement in STEM fields.
Beautiful.
And starting in 4th grade, and we follow kids longitudinally. And in another study, very similar design, also starting in 4th grade, we're looking to predict their mental health outcomes, and that's funded by the National Institutes of Health. And so we're including executive function, so some age-appropriate games that are similar to the ones that I've described to you. But we're not where we don't manipulate it. We're just looking to see, individual differences and age-related changes in these skills. executive function skills, but also personality. So we're starting to look at the intersection of some personality and character strengths with executive function skills. So things like conscientiousness.
So kind of big five stuff?
Big five stuff, exactly. And then we're also looking at what we call economic preferences. And so, as I mentioned, Professor Heckman is an economist, and economists use a lot of sort of hypothetical situations, kind of like the ones that I've described of, instead of actually sitting through the delay of a marshmallow test, it's a question of, would you wait for a larger reward in the future? If would you take $20 now, or would you wait two weeks for $100? And so these older kids, it's kind of fun to work with them because they're capable of answering those kinds of questions, of contemplating those hypotheticals and answering those questions, whereas the preschoolers aren't quite able to do that. And so looking at these three constructs, kind of economic decision-making, personality, and executive function skills, aligning the measures of those three constructs, looking at the interrelations between those three constructs as kids are developing from fourth grade, and then in a cross-like design, we'll be going all the way through 11th grade.
Okay.
And then, like I said, we're trying to predict, at the end of the day, how do these constructs, these skills, predict STEM interest and achievement as well. So, for example, whether kids are interested in higher education, and if so, is it a STEM major? And then with the mental health outcomes, we're particularly interested in anxiety, depression, sleep issues, and other top concerns among young people today, which you've probably heard have really been on the rise.
Right. And are those subjective self-assessments that you're doing as the follow-up, or is there some other measure you're using for the mental health side?
It's self-report as well as parent report.
Okay.
That we'll be collecting at each time point.
And then I was just reading about book deserts, which was fascinating to me. I thought the number they were using in their studies was 100 books in your household, which to me seemed like a relatively large number for the average population. But in any case, that was their baseline. Is that being included at all in this STEM follow-up? Because it seems like that's a major variable. If a child's growing up with, we have 1,700 books sitting in our office library that our kids and grandkids will have access to. It's just natural for them to be like, oh, yeah, of course I want to check this stuff out. Whereas if it was all TV and phones, so is that something you're tracking along the way with this? Is the integration of books or some sort of a baseline level with that?
Yes, and we're using, it's called the Home Survey, and there's a newer version of the Home Survey out that does inquire about things like that.
Okay.
So, trying to take into account the context,
right,
that more sort of home-based proximal context, as well as more general things like socioeconomic status.
Right. Interesting. This is great stuff. So a lot of things we've talked about is with children. If you had magical powers to change anything within today's school system, and it would automatically be followed by all, what might you choose? And it's a question out of the blue. I did not prep you with this, so you haven't had time to line it up. But what would be one or two of the things that might pop into your head as, Brad, I really think this could have a big impact?
And this is regarding
school system. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
if there's something that just automatically magic wand done, what might some of those be?
Well, I think that my research and my bias is going to show here, but we actually have enough evidence already to merit screening for executive function skills before kids even start school.
Mm.
And there's quite a bit of evidence that these executive function skills, including some of the affective decision making that I mentioned, but also some kind of cool, non-affective decision making and problem solving skills that are relatively context free. That these skills early in life predict readiness to learn. So kids with stronger executive function skills have stronger academic achievement, and even for children with lower socioeconomic status, which is a real risk factor for low achievement in school. If they nevertheless, despite lower socioeconomic status, have executive function skills that are on track for their age, then you're far less likely to see achievement gaps.
And so this assessment or this screening process, what would you envision this being utilized for? Would it be before we start first grade, before we start kindergarten, this has to happen? Or is it more as you come into first grade, kindergarten, whatever, we're going to add an extra course that will help develop these executive function? Kind of what would you have in mind for maybe teachers or administrators that are listening and thinking, oh, well, what would be a first step?
Well, it really can be beneficial at any age, and it's never too late. And schools, districts are starting to recognize in middle and high school that kids would really benefit from more organization, more planning, more self-control, better attention spans. These are all governed by executive function skills. Right. And so you're starting to see executive function coaching, kind of, tutoring, but instead of being strictly about math or science, it's executive function skills that are being tutored. And I think that's a wonderful development. But we do know that the younger you start, the earlier, the better in terms of being able to benefit from having stronger executive function skills at the point of kindergarten entry. So, and then the science of measurement is leading the field, and the interventions are playing catch up to those measurements, right? And so we're still, needing some work on the intervention side, and needing more evidence, more replication, and so forth. But I do believe that if we had kids who are starting off even from kindergarten with some better preparation in terms of executive function skills, that we might see better outcomes and have less remediation to do later.
That's interesting. All right. So you're involved with a company, and we'll link to the description of this, that helps enhance the professional performance for individuals and for teams. Can you unlock some of the steps that generally bubble up to the surface in terms of application there?
Sure. So about 9 years ago, we formed a company called Reflection Sciences, and that's out of the University of Minnesota. It's a startup out of there. And the reason was because we just started getting a lot of requests from educators for our assessment of executive function, called the Minnesota Executive Function Scale, and kind of needed an entity and a team to be able to manage that and build out professional development as well as the intervention side of things. And that's been very rewarding, very impactful, with over 175,000 assessments, kids pre-K through grade 12. But every time I would give a talk on executive function skills to a group of people who are interested in it for kids' sake, every time, pretty much, someone would come up to me afterward and say, "Oh my God, my staff needs this."
Totally. I mean, so many of our listeners are in health and wellness, health and well-being, performance, and they've got clients that are saying, I want to do this, but I don't. I think this is the route I want to go, but then nothing happens.
Right. Or,
Totally.
Just that question of how can some people be so smart
Yep.
and do things that are so stupid?
Yep. The wisdom is lacking. The IQ is there.
Yeah. And so, what we would argue is lacking is reflection. That's why we named our company Reflection Sciences. And reflection really kind of underlines these executive function skills, being able to pause, think twice, consider the context, consider your future, consequences and things like that. And it does require reflection. And then more recently, we created a kind of spin out of reflection sciences called reflective performance. And this is for adults. And so it could be college career, sort of preparation for careers beyond college. But it can also be for trades, industry, athletes, and individuals, adults who are struggling to enter the workforce or maintain employment. So recently incarcerated or drug rehabilitated adults. So we're working with that full gamut. On the athlete side, I know that's an interest of yours. Sure. We have been working with college athletes, and the way it works is they kind of their assessment journey is they view some educational information about executive function. Then they take our assessment, kind of an adult-facing version of this measure of executive function skills. They also answer some questions on a survey that are getting at that personality piece that we talked about, and as well as their level of engagement with the team, for example, and some cognitive reflection questions. So some of these are a little bit like brain teasers.
Sure. But it gets them processing. It gets them thinking through, how does this influence me and my direction and those kinds of things.
That's right. And then we're aligning, so those taking a look at those results and seeing how well they align with the coach's ratings of the players on, a similar set of items. So,
and then as part of the tool, creating that or forcing that reflection time, making that not just if I have time, I never do because I grab my phone every 5 seconds, but it literally builds it into their day or their week. Is that part of the process?
That's where we're headed. Yes. Okay. So at this point, we're still at the stage of what goes with what. So looking at these correlations so that we can better refine the survey. And this takes a number of years. It took a couple of decades with the executive function assessment to whittle it down to where in 5 minutes, we can really reliably measure your executive function skills. So we're kind of taking a broader perspective now, again, looking at, just how do these things go together? And then also we're interested not just in the individual and in individual performance, but team performance. And having these tools, executive function, reflection, and some of these personality strengths and assets, personal assets, to help ensure that kind of the right people are in the right seats, or to show we think of teams, whether it's an athletic team or a work team, as kind of like a miniature neural network, right? And so the different nodes need to communicate with one another, and there are stronger team compositions and weaker team compositions, which could very well depend in some respect on these foundational skills.
Yeah, that's interesting. Last question. We had Kelly McGonigal on the show. She laughingly reminded us that very frequently research is more me search. So, is there one big idea from your own research that's been a turbocharge in your own personal or professional life, or both?
How dare you ask that question?
Hey, you can blame Kelly. Give her a call.
Well, so she's not wrong. I would say that I got into this in part, this field of study and this topic in part because, I was struggling with my own procrastination, struggling with my own proneness toward distraction or a little bit of risk taking and a little bit of thrill seeking and things like that in my youth.
Sure.
So I have been fascinated about these strategies and behavioral insights, just some of these little nudges that can be really beneficial. So I do try to do the 24-hour rule on the emails that can, for example, and I do use the Batman effect.
And who is your character of choice?
Well, it literally got me through my preliminary exams when I was in graduate school. I was terrified of this exam. And it was kind of a 2-day, 2-day sit down. You don't know what the questions are going to be.
Exactly.
It's really intense. Your whole life depends on it. It feels like, this. And so I was almost paralyzed with fear before doing this. And I was doing a lot of reading, of course, to prepare. And I was reading a lot of more, of famous people in my field. And so there's a psychologist who's quite well known, Alison Gopnik, professor at Berkeley. She had a column in the Wall Street Journal and so forth. And she just, her scholarly articles were written in such a way that I found really engaging. And she had a way of presenting that I found to be really confident. And so I pretended that I was Alison Gopnik while I was doing prelims.
Interesting.
And literally would say to myself, well, okay, what would Alison say? How would Alison answer this question? And that mostly it was that, she would bring, it seemed to me that she would bring some feelings of self-assurance and confidence to the task. And then I didn't tell her until many years later when she wrote she included, she did a column on the Batman effect in the Wall Street Journal. And I said, thank you for writing about that and, disseminating that. And I just have to tell you that you were my Batman.
What was that interaction like? Did she just start laughing? Was she like, oh my word, this is great?
She did find it kind of humorous. Her husband found it very humorous, she said. But she was very touched by it.
So you just mentioned her husband thinking it was humorous. That sparked a different idea. Have you seen anything either in your own research or in looking at related research where the partnership effect? I mean, I respect the socks off my wife, and oftentimes I find myself thinking, well, how would Susanna approach this? Because it's very different than how I would, and it's usually a pretty valuable way to approach it. Has that close of a relationship been studied where it's literally that partner versus a superhero or a famous researcher or a book character or something?
I would have to ask my friend Ethan Cross. I'm not certain if that has been done. I think it's a good idea. And really, it could be anyone that inspires you or who
different approach.
Yeah, and just so the sort of Solomon, King Solomon idea, like that we're always better at giving giving advice to others
Always.
Instead of taking our own advice.
100%.
So just, kind of externalizing it, whether it's a real person or an imagined person, can be highly effective.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Carlson. This is fantastic. Looking forward to following your work as you move forward. Great stuff. And thank you for the confession at the end there. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Wow, so much there. I mean, the impulse control piece with kids, you could hear the overlap into what we're doing as adults, and even building on that reflection piece and how that affects our executive function. Whew. Talk about application. Thanks for joining us on this latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. If you're an employer, EAP, or wellness service provider looking to move beyond generic coaching for those you serve, Catalyst Coaching 360 has been the best-in-class leader focused on coaching since 2007. In addition, you can now access a range of specialty coaching options, including tobacco cessation, pre- and post-surgery outcomes, and high-performance elite executive and managerial coaching. All the details at catalystcoaching360.com or reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoaching360.com. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching 360, Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.